The crane dropped through my roof like a wrecking ball aimed straight at my spine. Glass shattered. Wood snapped. The entire top corner of my living room vanished into a mangled mess of insulation, drywall, and twisted steel, and I knew without a doubt that this wasn't an accident. My name's Nolan Carrick. I'm a 39-year-old electrician, father of one, and I used to think the worst thing about our neighborhood was the traffic on weekends. That was before Trina Delsworth got herself elected president of the Crest Meadow HOA. Trina was the type of woman who wore oversized sunglasses even when it rained and called the cops if your grass got over 3 inches high. Platinum hair, fake smile, and a voice that carried like a leaf blower at 6 a.m., she was every bad HOA cliché wrapped in a cardigan. It all started when I refused to pay a bogus fine. She claimed my work van, which was parked neatly in my own driveway, violated aesthetic harmony. Never mind the fact that my neighbor had a literal boat in his yard. I called her bluff, cited the bylaws word for word, and appealed the fine. That's when the real trouble started. Mysterious complaints started popping up against me: noise, trash cans being out a day too early, suspicious home business allegations. I knew Trina was behind them, using her lapdogs on the board to try and drown me in paperwork and fines. But I didn't back down. I started attending every HOA meeting, reading the rules aloud. I printed out copies of the bylaws and handed them out to neighbors. People were listening, starting to question her authority, and that's when she brought in the crane. They claimed it was for tree removal on the lot next door, but I wasn't born yesterday. There were no permits, no flagged trees, just a giant yellow crane parked suspiciously close to my fence. I caught 2 guys from her cousin's construction company snooping around my property line with measuring tape. I called the city inspector. He said no one had filed anything. Classic. The next morning, I left for work at 6. My daughter Kenzie was staying at her mom's that week, thank God. At 10:15, my phone blew up. My neighbor, old Mr. Harlan, had called me in a panic. "Nolan, a crane just fell on your house." I broke every speed limit getting home. When I turned the corner, I saw it half the boom arm of that crane sticking straight through my living room ceiling like some kind of mechanical javelin. There were bystanders, news vans, cops. Trina was standing nearby in her ridiculous heels, arms crossed like she was annoyed the crane hadn't flattened the whole house. I marched up to her. "What the hell did you do?" She didn't even flinch. "It was an unfortunate accident. You really should have moved that van." Emergency access is very important. "You dropped a crane on my house, Trina." "It was the contractor's mistake. I'll be sure to email you the insurance contact." She turned away like we were discussing a pothole, but here's the thing: Trina didn't know who she was messing with. I had cameras. I had recordings. And I had a copy of every email, board decision, and permit denial she ever sent. She wanted to silence me. She just gave me a megaphone. The city inspector showed up 2 hours after the crane pierced my house. He was a lanky guy named Curtis, clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, and he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Still, when he stepped under the caution tape near the sidewalk and saw the mess, his jaw went slack. I didn't wait for greetings. "Tell me you didn't approve this." Curtis shook his head. "There's no active permit for crane usage on this street. This is a major code violation and potentially criminal negligence." I pointed up at the boom arm still lodged through my roof like a harpoon. "You think?" He started snapping photos, muttering to himself. I stayed quiet until he stopped, then asked the only question that mattered. "Can you get me the name of the contractor?" He nodded. "That's public record." "But if they didn't file a permit, they're already in deep." I got the name 30 minutes later, Vantage Point Services. That rang a bell. I pulled up an old HOA meeting video on my phone, scrolled to the part where Trina introduced her preferred vendors for community maintenance. There it was. Her cousin's company. The same one that accidentally dropped a crane into my living room. I took Curtis aside. "This wasn't just negligence, this was retaliation," he frowned. "Retaliation for what?" I challenged the board on illegal fines. They've been escalating ever since. Someone sent that crane without a permit and conveniently dropped it on the only house that's been fighting them. Curtis blinked slowly, then pulled out a different notepad, the kind with carbon triplicate sheets. All right. I'm documenting this as a suspected targeted act. You'll need to file a police report. I'll send everything I have to the city attorney. Good. That was a start. But I wasn't done. I called my friend Rafi, a building code lawyer who owed me a favor after I fixed the wiring in his mother's cafe for free. He answered on the second ring. "Tell me this isn't about the HOA again," he said. "They dropped a construction crane on my house." Silence. "Okay, I wasn't ready for that. I need you to help me sue them into the Stone Age," he exhaled slowly. "You're not going to like what I say next. You can't sue the HOA directly unless you prove gross misconduct or criminal conspiracy. But if the board acted outside their capacity and used HOA funds or power for personal retaliation, they did. Then we've got something. You'll need evidence, emails, financial records. Anything proving collusion. I already had some of that. After they tried to fine me for the van, I'd started filing FOIA requests with the city. I'd also requested meeting minutes, vendor contracts, and HOA spending reports. Most of it was redacted or vague, but there were patterns. Trina had pushed through a land beautification budget increase 2 months ago. The funds were routed through Vantage Point. The address on the invoice was listed as common area next to Lot 17. That was my house. I sent it to Rafi. "Start there," he said. "And check if any board members have undisclosed relationships with the contractor. If they used community funds for personal vengeance, that's fraud." I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor of my half-demolished home, laptop balanced on my knees, digging through every document I had. By dawn, I'd built a timeline. The crane incident wasn't random. It was the final move in a pattern of harassment. Before the sun was fully up, I was at City Hall requesting access to HOA financial disclosures. They were reluctant at first, but once I mentioned a pending criminal investigation, things moved faster. I got the full vendor log for the last 2 years. Vantage Point had been paid over $200,000 for work that didn't appear to exist. Tree trimming on streets with no trees. Sidewalk repairs that never happened. And the kicker, a payment labeled emergency site prep 5 days before the crane incident. That payment was signed off by Trina and her vice president, a guy named Clark Mendon. I'd seen him once at a meeting, a guy who wore cufflinks to a potluck, and once threatened to tow someone's car for having a bumper sticker he didn't like. I printed everything and brought it to the precinct. The officer at the desk leaned back after flipping through the documents. "You're telling me the HOA president paid her cousin's company without a permit, dropped a crane on your house, and tried to pass it off as an accident?" "Exactly." He called in a detective. That's when things really picked up. By the end of the week, a formal investigation was opened by the district attorney's office. Curtis, the inspector, submitted a sworn statement. Rafi filed a civil suit on my behalf, naming Trina, Clark, and the HOA itself as co-defendants. The insurance adjuster visited 2 days later. He took one look at the wreckage and said, "This isn't going to be a fast claim. You're telling me." But while the insurance dragged their heels, I made sure the court didn't. I organized a neighborhood meeting, not a board-sanctioned one, but a real gathering out on the community green. I brought copies of the vendor payments. I handed out a timeline. I even had a copy of the crane operator's statement, which I'd acquired through a contact in the DA's office. He admitted under oath that he was told to position the crane as close as possible to the Carrick property line. When asked why, he said, "It came from the top, some kind of dispute. I didn't ask questions." That was enough for most of the neighborhood, people starting asking questions. Why were HOA dues raised 3 times in the past year? Why were their streets still cracked and their playgrounds still missing swings? Where had all that money gone? Then someone mentioned that Trina's Lexus had gotten a new paint job and Clark had recently installed a deck that looked like it belonged on a yacht. The next day, I received a cease and desist letter from the HOA's lawyer, claiming I was spreading defamatory and unverified claims. I added it to my folder of evidence. A week later, the writ of summons was delivered to Trina's door. She opened it in front of 3 neighbors, stared at the envelope like it was a dead rat, and slammed the door without a word. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, the city issued a stop work order on all HOA-funded projects. Their accounts were frozen pending audit. One board member resigned. Another posted an anonymous apology on the community forum. But Trina, she doubled down. She called an emergency HOA meeting, only board members allowed, and tried to pass a motion to suspend my membership and voting rights. That's when I walked in with 2 plainclothes detectives and a subpoena. Trina tried to pull the private meeting card. One of the detectives flashed his badge and said, "Not tonight, it isn't." They served her and Clark with warrants for financial records, emails, and personal devices. The look on her face wasn't anger, it was fear, real, bone-deep panic. As we walked out, the detective leaned toward me and said, "You were right. This goes beyond petty fines." I nodded. "I figured." He raised an eyebrow. "You okay living there while this plays out?" I looked back at the crane still embedded in my house, tarped over with bright blue plastic. "I've got nothing to hide. Let her be the one who can't sleep." The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not physically, it just had that sterile, airless feel, like the kind of place meant to suppress emotion. Mahogany desks, tall windows, and a judge who looked like he'd rather be refereeing a chess match than dealing with HOA misconduct. But I wasn't here for comfort. I was here for accountability. Trina sat at the defense table in a sharp navy blazer, hair pulled back tight enough to raise her eyebrows. Clark sat beside her, shifting every few seconds like the chair had spikes. Their lawyer, a man with too much gel in his hair and not enough patience in his tone, had already tried to get the case dismissed on procedural grounds. The judge denied it without even glancing up. Raffi and I had spent the last 3 weeks preparing for this. He'd gone through every financial transaction, every permit request, every HOA email chain we could legally obtain. The subpoenaed records from the board's private communications had turned up something explosive messages between Trina, Clark, and the contractor, discussing how to apply pressure to non-compliant residents, including my name more than once. The most damning line came from Trina herself. "If Carrick keeps pushing, we'll make an example out of him. He wants to play lawyer. Let's see how he reacts to a little property damage." The courtroom went still when Raffi read that aloud. Trina's lawyer objected, claiming it was out of context. The judge allowed it anyway, stating the jury could determine the weight. There were 8 jurors, 3 women, 5 men, none of whom looked particularly amused by the defense's arguments, especially not after the detective testified. He explained how the HOA bypassed city procedures and funneled money to Trina's cousin's company through padded invoices. The term he used was intentional fraud under the guise of community maintenance. Then came the crane operator. His boots thudded against the polished floor as he took the stand. He looked uncomfortable, not just in the chair, but in his own skin. Sweat dotted his collar. "I didn't know what I was getting into," he said. "They just told us to set up by lot 17. Said they'd handle the paperwork after." He took a breath. "When I saw the boom swing the wrong way, I screamed into the radio, but it was too late. We clipped the corner of the house." Raffi stepped forward. "Did anyone from the HOA ever suggest that this operation should intimidate or inconvenience the homeowner?" The man hesitated, then nodded. "She said, and I quote, make sure he gets the message." That was the moment the courtroom shifted. You could feel it, the jury leaning forward, the judge's chin lifting slightly, even the bailiff straightening behind the bench. We didn't even need to call every witness after that. The case had cracked wide open, but the surprises weren't over. The city's forensic accountant had completed their audit of the HOA's books just days before the trial. They found over $70,000 of expenditures with no corresponding work orders, just vague descriptions like improvement consulting and community compliance action. A significant chunk had been routed through a shell company registered in Nevada. That company, owned by Clark's brother-in-law, during cross-examination, Clark tried to play dumb, said he had no idea where the payments went, that maybe the treasurer handled it, that he wasn't looped in on every detail. Raffi leaned back, hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Mendon, do you recognize this email?" He put a printout on the overhead. The subject line read, "Vendor routing, keep clean." Clark blinked. "I might have seen it. Please read the first sentence. Make sure the board signs off on the Q3 disbursement to Cobalt Solutions before the audit window closes." "And who sent that email?" I did." That was enough. Trina didn't speak once during the trial. Her lawyer did all the talking for her, and most of it was deflection. But juries don't like silence when someone's house has been torn open by a crane. They especially don't like silence when your name is on every decision that led to it. 3 days later, the verdict came in. Guilty on all civil counts. The judge ordered Trina, Clark, and the HOA to pay full restitution for the damages to my home, plus punitive damages for intentional misconduct and emotional distress. Vantage Point lost their contractor license and was barred from taking municipal jobs for 5 years. But what mattered most wasn't the money. It was the ruling that Trina and Clark had acted willfully and maliciously under the color of authority. That triggered a separate investigation by the state attorney general's office. The following week, they were arrested for conspiracy to commit fraud, misuse of public funds, and criminal endangerment. The criminal charges carried real time. Trina was facing up to 10 years. Clark, with his added financial trail, was looking at 15. I stood in the back of the municipal building the morning they were taken into custody. No press, no crowd. Just a couple police cars, 2 officers, and a pair of former HOA tyrants walking out in cuffs. The moment Clark saw me, he muttered something under his breath. Trina didn't look at me. She kept her eyes forward like she was still pretending none of it was real, but it was. I wasn't the only homeowner they'd targeted. After the verdict, 3 other residents filed claims for fines that were never documented, landscaping fees that never led to actual work, and threats of foreclosure over small balance dues that had no legal standing. It turned out, the HOA had been weaponized for years. Trina and her circle had turned it into a personal fiefdom, using the rules to silence dissent and rake in cash through phantom projects. The crane incident wasn't just an escalation, it was a symptom of a system already rotting. In the aftermath, the city placed the HOA under temporary receivership. A neutral third-party attorney was appointed to manage operations while the community reorganized. Elections were scheduled, this time with oversight from city officials. For the first time in years, people were engaged volunteering, attending open forums, asking questions. I didn't run for anything. I didn't need to. My house was patched. The insurance came through after the ruling. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before stopped by with casseroles, beers, and even handwritten notes. One guy I didn't know dragged his grill over and cooked dinner for my daughter and me on a Tuesday night. Justice didn't fix the hole in the ceiling, but it fixed something deeper. It reminded us that neighborhoods aren't supposed to be controlled by fear and ego. They're supposed to be places where people live not under someone but alongside each other. And if anyone ever forgot that again, well, I still had the crane photos framed on my wall, a reminder of what it took to pull the rot out by the roots. 3 weeks after the verdict, the Crestmeadow HOA office was stripped bare. The glass door had been shattered during a late-night break-in, no one knew by whom, though half the neighborhood had theories. The sign that once hung proudly beside the entrance, etched with "Preserving Excellence," now lay in the overgrown front hedges, cracked in half. I hadn't been near the place since the trial, but I had to return. The court-appointed receiver, a quiet former probate lawyer named Melinda Cross, had asked me to meet her there. "You need to see what we found," she'd said on the phone, voice tight. Inside, the place looked abandoned. Filing cabinets had been emptied hastily, some left half open. The HVAC buzzed like it hadn't been serviced in years. Melinda stood beside a folding table covered in manila folders, and two bankers' boxes marked Archive AJ and Archive KZ. She motioned to the table. "We found these in a locked drawer Trina had labeled Old Correspondence." I flipped open the top folder. Inside were printed letters addressed to various homeowners, most of them typed on HOA letterhead, all of them unsigned. Melinda stepped closer. They were never sent, but they were written. Every one of them contains language instructing residents to either pay unlisted compliance fees or risk lien placement. Some even mention turning over property rights if dues aren't paid within 30 days. I scanned one addressed to a woman named Darlene from the west side of the neighborhood. It claimed she owed nearly $6,000 in backdated landscaping dues for a project that never occurred. Attached was a copy of her property deed, marked up with sticky notes. Melinda handed me a flash drive. We also recovered digital files. There's a spreadsheet tracking homeowners by compliance level, green for compliant, yellow for at risk, red for hostile. You were labeled red within 3 days of challenging the fine about your van. I didn't respond. I just stared at the screen as she loaded the file. There were over 100 names, each with notes ranging from willing to negotiate to watch closely, and in one case, pressure via code enforcement. Melinda leaned on the table, her expression unreadable. "This goes beyond fraud. It's targeted harassment through a quasi-governmental body. The DA's office is treating this as racketeering." I turned toward the wall where a corkboard still hung. Faded flyers for block parties and outdated pool schedules clung to the edges. In the center was a photo of the board Trina, Clark, and the other 3 members who had quietly resigned during the unraveling. All of them standing with folded arms in front of the Crestmeadow fountain. Melinda followed my gaze. They thought no one would ever question them. That's the danger of unchecked authority in private governance. I nodded but said nothing. The rot went deeper than any of us had guessed, and it wasn't just about money. Later that week, I met with Tara Lentz, a state investigator assigned to the case. She invited me to her office on the 3rd floor of a dull gray building that overlooked a bus depot. Her walls were covered in maps of neighborhood associations and zoning overlays. She offered me a seat and slid a folder across the desk. "Thought you should see where this is going," she said. Inside were affidavits, dozens of them. Some of these residents never even realized they'd signed away their rights, Tara said. Trina and her board added clauses to the annual HOA renewal form's fine print at the bottom, buried under the boilerplate. It gave the board sweeping power to enforce corrective action without a vote. I read a line aloud. "The board reserves the right to make structural decisions on behalf of the homeowner in the event of non-compliance. That's how they justified the crane, isn't it?" She nodded. They interpreted it as permission to remove structures they claimed violated aesthetic cohesion. In your case, they argued your van constituted a permanent modification. I sat back, stunned. They rewrote the rules just to shut people up. Tara didn't deny it. We're building a criminal case. Not just against Trina and Clark, but anyone who signed off on those alterations. If we can prove they coordinated to enrich themselves while stripping residents of their property rights, it'll qualify under RICO. I blinked. You're charging them as an organized crime ring, if it fits. And it did. By the end of the month, the state filed additional charges against Trina, Clark, and 2 other former board members. Mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the public, and operating a racketeering enterprise. The story made the regional news. Crestmeadow was no longer just a local cautionary tale, it had become a statewide example of unchecked HOA power. Then came the restitution hearings. Over 40 homeowners filed claims for manipulated fees, forged documents, and retaliatory actions. The court established a victim fund, seeded with the seized assets from the board members' personal accounts. Trina's lake house was sold at auction. Clark's investment condo in Asheville was liquidated. Between the two of them, nearly $400,000 was recovered. I didn't attend their sentencing, but I read the transcript. Trina attempted a last-minute plea for leniency, claiming she acted in the community's best interest. The judge interrupted her mid-sentence. You orchestrated a campaign of fear and financial coercion against your neighbors. You violated the trust placed in you and turned a civic body into a weapon. That is not leadership, that is exploitation. She received 9 years, Clark got 11. The others took plea deals, agreed to lifetime bans from serving on any HOA or civic board, and walked away with felony records and suspended sentences. Crestmeadow changed after that. Under Melinda's supervision, a new charter was drafted. It stripped the Board of Enforcement powers without a resident vote, implemented mandatory third-party audits, and required all vendor contracts to be publicly posted 30 days prior to approval. Perhaps most importantly, it included a clause allowing homeowners to opt out of non-essential dues without penalty. I declined a seat on the reformed board. I'd done my part, but the neighborhood didn't forget. A month after the final ruling, the community threw a potluck in the park. Someone brought a sheet cake shaped like a crane, complete with frosting rubble spilling across the side. It was ridiculous and perfect. Kenzie, my daughter, ran around with a group of kids, laughing like she didn't have a care in the world. That was the real win, not the money, not the headlines. But the knowledge that she could grow up in a place where fairness actually meant something. As the sun dipped behind the trees, a man approached me with a cautious expression. He introduced himself as Alex, a homeowner from 2 streets over. He said he'd never spoken out before, always assumed the board knew best. I just wanted to say thanks, he said. For standing up, I didn't think anyone could win against them, I shrugged. You don't need to be loud to make change. You just need to be right and patient. He smiled, nodded once, and walked back toward the crowd. Later that night, I stood in my rebuilt living room, a fresh coat of paint on the walls and a new ceiling where the crane had once punched through. The place didn't look the same, and that was good. It had been scarred, yes, but it had healed stronger. There was one last thing left to do. I took the framed photo of the crane embedded in my roof and hung it in the hallway just outside the laundry room. Not as a trophy, not as a warning, but as proof. Proof that no matter how heavy the machinery, how high the power, or how corrupt the authority, truth, when wielded with discipline, facts, and courage, cuts deeper, and it doesn't miss.